Hi everyone, welcome to the August 13th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's stakes races, which was led by the Arlington Million Day card at Arlington Park. Really, it was the Chad Brown Day card, though, because he swept all of those stakes races. We'll also touch upon some major races from the past weekend at Saratoga, where they ran the Grade 1 Fourstardave on Saturday, as well as a bunch of promising two-year-olds that debuted last weekend over the weekend. And we'll wrap up the show by looking at some races from Del Mar, where they ran the Best Pal, and Rancho Bernardo on Saturday and Sunday. So, Craig, how are you doing this weekend? I saw your wife posted that hornet's nest on Twitter. Did you survive that situation?
I did. I actually did my husbandly duty, and I went and took care of it. It's no longer an issue.
I really admire your bravery there. I would not have been able to tackle that. So
I had experience from my Air Force days, so no problem there.
So let's dive right into the stakes races and start at Arlington Park, where I won't say he's the best horse in the country, but certainly the most accomplished horse racing right now in 2019. Bricks and Mortar just continued doing what he has been doing all year. Won another Grade 1 race. Did it as reliably as you would expect him to do. Got a good trip on the rail, swung out, and just ran those horses down. I don't really know what to say about this horse at this point. He just shows up every time, and I think you could say at this point in the year, he's probably the leading contender for Horse of the Year.
Yeah, I would say so. He just keeps ripping off these $1 million or more races. He's doing it easy. Like you said, he did get a good trip, but I think he's a horse who kind of makes his own trip, and that hasn't always been the case. He ran a very nice 130 TimeformUS speed figure, and he did it beating what I think is probably the best field he's faced all year. I mean, Robert Bruce looked like maybe he could give him a run coming in. Magic Wand's proven herself to be a really good filly, and they just couldn't touch him. He won easier than the 3/4 of a length margin would indicate, and I would agree with you. I think he's a leading candidate for Horse of the Year right now.
And that 130 TimeformUS speed figure, that's really as high as you see a lot of these turf horses running in the United States. Even the top Grade 1 races usually get in that 125 to 129 range. You don't see too many turf horses getting figs of 130 and above, and that really does put them in good standing moving ahead to races like the Breeders' Cup at the end of the year, where you see a lot of the top European horses come in. They do have that tough decision to make, and it sounds like Chad Brown's pretty much made it, saying that they're going to point to the Breeders' Cup turf at 1.5 miles instead of the Breeders' Cup Mile, which would be a turn back from about 1/4 mile. It makes sense to me. I think the Breeders' Cup turf is probably the right option for this horse. While he's never gone farther than 1.25 miles, he certainly has the pedigree to do it. So it'll get tougher with some Europeans coming over, but he's certainly the best American turf horse out there.
He is, and I mean, I'm certainly not going to question Chad Brown after the day that he had. If he says 1.5 miles is the way to go, I tend to agree with him. In this case, if someone asked, that's what I would have said as well. I think the turn back would be a little tougher. I'm not sure he has that high cruising speed that you need at 1 mile, but I mean, just a really good horse, and nice to see him come back. He had been laid off for quite a while after showing some real promise as a younger horse, and the patience that his owner and trainer showed with him to get him in the spot is just pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really is. You don't see horses be out of training with a serious issue for that long and come back better than ever. It's just such a rare thing to do, and it's a credit to Chad Brown and the Connections Patience that they were able to do it with this horse. And just elaborating a little more on his pedigree, because I was looking it up recently to see if he really could go longer distances. I know Chad Brown sounds a little bit apprehensive about it, just given that burst of speed that he has going shorter races. But I mean, the horses that he's half siblings to, they wanted every bit of 1.5 miles, and some of them even farther than that. He's a half brother to Emerald Beach, who I believe won the Weigh-It in Glens Falls up here a number of years ago, going 1.5 miles, and she could go even farther than that. In Europe, he was a half to a horse that I think won going as far as 1.75 miles. So Bricks and Mortar does have a ton of stamina on the dam side of his pedigree, and it's just going to be fascinating to see if he can translate his form out to that distance. As for the others in this Arlington Million, Magic Wand, she showed up again in the U.S. and ran really well. She's kind of a funny horse because her European form overall is just okay. She's like a Group 2, Group 3 kind of horse over there, but she really does seem to put forth her best efforts in the United States, and I thought this was one of her best efforts yet that she's put together over here. Bandu and Robert Bruce, they're okay. They're just not in the same league as these horses.
Yeah, I agree. Magic Wand was really good. I'm not sure that, even though she didn't win, they probably still made the right call, because I don't know if she'd had any more luck tackling Sister Charlie, who we're going to talk about here in a second. And as you say, Bandoa, he's a very nice horse. He's real consistent. He set a solid, if not spectacular, pace. He ran as usual, about a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, and just not quite good enough. And I think we can say the same about Robert Bruce at this point. There's nothing wrong with being a notch below bricks and mortar. It still probably makes you a grade 1 horse in this country, but he's just not on that one's level.
Yeah, I think it illustrates how much more, let's just say, mediocre last year's Million field was than this one. That Robert Bruce probably ran the same races last year. He just was meeting much better horses this time around. Moving on to the filly version of the Arlington Million, the Beverly D, which was run 2 races earlier on Saturday. Sister Charlie, a lot like bricks and mortar, although she hasn't run quite as many times this year yet. She just keeps getting better and better with each start, it seems. She was totally dominant over this field here. I mean, that was expected because she was the heavy odds-on favorite. But much like the Diana, her stablemate Thais went out and set a very fast pace on the front end. It fell apart in front of her, but Sister Charlie, she just made this really impressive move around the far turn to break the race open at the top of the stretch, and the victory just never looked to be in doubt.
No, it didn't. And this is a case where she got a 128. We actually gave the runner-up a 129 due to the really fast pace and that one chase. But if they were to meet up again, it seems like that's going to be the plan maybe the year. And she's a good horse in her own right. I mean, she's this isn't your typical rabbit who's just in there for a half mile. She can take these horses a long way and set a really legitimate pace. And Sister Charlie is she's something special. I know we talked about her last time, how she's kind of flying under the radar, but, I don't know what else she has to do other than maybe take on males to get more notice. But she just looks like a really tough mare who it's hard to envision her losing any point against her own sex.
Yeah, I was thinking of bringing that up because there really is no incentive to run her against males at this point, because Chad Brown really has the top male horse that will be running in those races. And I doubt she's going to run against bricks and mortar at any point in the future. But she is starting to earn some speed figures that suggest she would be on par with those horses. So she's just really good right now. And I don't see anybody out there that can beat her going distances anywhere from a mile and a 16th out to a mile and 3/8, which she showed that she could handle in the Breeders' Cup last year. So she's just really good. And I agree with what you said about Thais, who is better than your average rabbit that you see in these races. Now, I don't know how much stock I really want to put in the 126 TimeformUS speed figure that she got in this race, because I'm sure that's a little bit inflated due to the pace situation. And you can talk maybe a little bit about what those extremely high pace figures mean for the first couple of calls of this race. I think she got 177s for both the first and second call, which you just don't see that often in the pace figure lines. But she's a nice horse in her own right that definitely could be turned back to a distance like a mile and probably do some damage.
Yeah, she definitely could. And as far as the pace figure goes, just for people who are maybe new or not all that familiar with our stuff, the 177 is for this distance. We're not saying she could turn back to a 6 furlong race and beat male sprinters who are getting 130 and 140 pace figures. But for this distance on this surface, it's just way too fast for the optimal way you want to run this race, which in this case, it's her job. That's what she sent out to do, set a fast pace, kind of, make sure that Sister Charlie has something to run into. But, when you're looking at these pace figures, compare them to the final time. That's what they're meant for. Don't try to compare them to other races on other surfaces at other distances.
Move on to the 3-year-old turf races from Arlington Park on Saturday, the Secretariat and the Pucker Up. Now, they did something new with the Secretariat this year where they made it a mile race, a flat mile, instead of a mile and a quarter, which it was previously. It's still a grade 1 for now, and I'll say for now because it's not going to stay a grade 1 if it continues to draw fields like this. But the 3-year-olds do have a lot of options at this point in the year with the series that New York has put together at Belmont and Saratoga. Chad Brown continued his dominance at Arlington Park, winning this race with Valid Point, who now is 3 for 3 in his career. This race did sort of fall apart at the end, even though the pace figures aren't red. It wasn't a particularly fast pace, but it was dominated by closers.
It was. The winner got a 113, which is, nothing special. He had run a 112 last time out. he was kind of the co-favored entry, non-coupled entry with Chad Brown's other horse who didn't run well. The name's escaping me for a second. Fog of War, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But, he's kind of an enigma now. He seems to be running either really good or not show up, which he didn't really show up here. But I don't think this race was very strong. I guess the turn back to a mile is because of the Saratoga Derby, which we saw. I assume that race is going to grow as it gets rated and take away some of the field. So maybe they're trying to make a preemptive move to attract a different kind of horses that want a little shorter distance. But in this case, it wasn't a particularly strong race, nothing I'm going to be excited about. And I'm certainly not going to treat these horses as Grade 1 horses when they come back.
Yeah, it sounds like wishful thinking, but you'd love to see these racetracks actually work together a little bit to make sure that there aren't too many races for the same kinds of horses, because it seems a little redundant at Saratoga for them to run both the Saratoga Derby and the Hall of Fame and then have the Secretariat at Arlington. There are just too many spots for horses we were lucky this year, I think, to have so many horses for these races, but I could see in future years it being a real problem, having just so many opportunities for the same division. Within just a couple of weeks of each other. Valid Point's a good horse. His win at Belmont back in June, it was very visually impressive. I know he wasn't beating the best field that day, but this is a horse that has always trained really well for Chad Brown, even though he hasn't actually run that much. As long as he stays sound, and he's only had 3 starts between February and now, so I think that's a question mark. But as long as he stays together, I think he's a horse that could continue developing. He'll have to run some faster speed figures in the future. It was interesting that they went so hard for one Aidan O'Brien horse as opposed to the other, and the less heralded of the two, Van Beethoven, got up for second. I didn't think the form of his was that much worse than Never No More, the other horse that they sent over. But I think he also benefited from the flow of the races. It just kind of fell apart at the end.
Yeah, I do. The one thing I would say about Valid Point is he did show some versatility. He's been a lot closer to the pace in his first couple wins. And you definitely want to see that on turf. You don't want your horse to be pace dependent. Because, as we've seen, you can see a wide variety of pace scenarios in these turf races. So I did like his versatility. But again, it's getting that point of year where you'd like to see the 3-year-olds closing the gap as they are on dirt with their older horses. But I'm just not seeing it on turf. So I'm really a little down on this division. Maybe it'll change. We still got a few months before they'll each other, but at this point, I think it's a big gap between the two.
I really agree with that, and I think the races this past weekend really do illustrate that. We'll wrap up Chad Brown's quartet of graded stakes victories on Saturday with the Pucker Up, which was the last stakes that they ran at Arlington on Saturday, and Cafe Americano, who has a pretty similar profile to Valid Point, stepped down from the Belmont Oaks into this Pucker Up, a Grade 3 event, to win. She had won her first 2 starts pretty impressively, kind of like Valid Point. They just took a shot in the Belmont Oaks last time, and she really wasn't as good as those fillies. But I thought she took a nice step forward in this race. She really did make an impressive rush to the lead around the far turn.
She did. She's improved every time out, all the way up to a 110 this time, which is almost as fast as the Secretariat. Decent horse. I'm curious to see. Maybe she'll get another shot against better. She'd certainly have to improve. But, she looked like of all the Chad Brown races with Chad Brown entrants in it, this looked like the one was most vulnerable. And it didn't turn out that way at all. She won the race pretty easily, basically in hand the last 50 yards or so. And, so an easy win, and we'll see where she turns up next.
Yeah, I agree with that. She's got upside, but she's going to have to run a little faster in the future as these races get tougher moving into the fall. Okay, so let's move on to Saratoga, where we had a bunch of stakes races, as well as some allowance and 2-year-old races that we'll discuss. But we'll begin with the feature race from Saturday, the Grade 1 Fourstardave. There were a couple of fillies facing the boys in this race, but the less heralded of the two was the one that really just dominated a second. You don't often see horses breaking track records by quite that kind of margin. And I would imagine that while the turf courses have been very firm and we've seen some track records fall recently, this is a course record that's probably going to stand for a very long time.
Yeah, we had actually talked about her last week, of course, not knowing at the time that she was going to turn around and run 7 days later when she had missed the track record by just 0.02 of a second. So part of it, the course is really fast, but you also have to have a really good horse to break a track record like that. Everything kind of came together. to see how fast the track was, she only, and I say only because it's a very good figure, but when you see a record smash like that, maybe some people would expect higher. But she got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. I got a little flack for that on social media, people telling me it was too low, but I really have no problem making that figure. It was a fairly easy figure to make. This wasn't a particularly strong grade one field. I mean, we had horses like Uni and Raging Bull as the top two choices. Who one's a female trying males for the first time, and another's a horse who hasn't had a lot of success this year while running against Stormy two weeks in a row. I know we both kind of were very impressed the week before with her, but it is what it is. She ran a grade one race. I don't think the others in the field did.
Yeah, and the people that are saying that the speed figure should be higher, you have to realize she only won this race by 2.5 lengths. And I say only, that's a pretty large margin on the turf. I get that, but she would have had to win by a much larger margin to not inflate the numbers of the horses that finished behind her. Because like you were saying, we can't make Raging Bull, Uni, March to the Arch all be getting career best speed figures in the same race. That would be a little suspicious. And while Got Stormy did set this track record and do it decisively, and she ran about 2/5 of a second faster than everybody else in this field, we should mention that Guido went out and set this insanely fast pace and really did set up the track record. So while Got Stormy ran very well, whoever won this race was going to be setting a track record because of what Guido did. I mean, I think you could even go all the way down to, I'm going to guess, the 7th or 8th place finisher, Dr. Edgar and Krampus, or maybe just Hembry, who finished 6th. They would have set track records too, because they only ran about 3/5 to 4/5 of a second slower than Got Stormy. So this was just a very fast race run by all of these horses. But that was largely due to the fast pace that was set and just the overall speed of the turf course. All that said, taking nothing away from Got Stormy, she is just in really good form right now. Can she turn into another Tepin for Mark Casse? I think it's way too early to suggest that. But if she stays this good, she's certainly on her way.
She is, and that's a really good point about the pace. That's certainly part of the track record too. We got the Summer Olympics coming up next year, I believe it is. You'll see the horses out there setting in these track meets we see this time of year as they get ready for the Olympics. You see a lot of the meets in Poi Rabbits because they want track records. They get somebody to go out there and set a fast pace. We don't often get that in horse racing, but that's what you need. When you want horses to run as fast as they can, they need to chase a fast pace, and that's definitely what we saw here.
And we didn't mention it, but we saw the exact same thing in the Beverly D, where Sister Charlie actually set a track record because of the fast pace that Thais set for her. So those are the situations where you typically do see track records being set on the turf. We'll move on to the other major stakes race on Saturday at Saratoga. That was for the 2-year-olds, the Saratoga Special. Green Light Go. I've been really high on this horse ever since I saw his debut at Belmont. Wasn't the fast compared to the other horses he's running against. He looks like a 3-year-old compared to the 2-year-olds. And he won the Saratoga Special as easily as you can. He ran it for the first time, took over, despite still being a little green at the top of the stretch. He was lugging in, but once he got straightened out, he just ran away from these horses, survived a fast pace. I liked everything I saw from this horse.
Yeah, that was a really strong effort from him. He got a 108 speed figure, back to 99 in second place. So, the gap and the margin kind of match up there. And just was coming out of a strong race. I think the runner-up had already come back to win with a really nice figure. And he handled the extra distance just fine. He had broke his maiden at just 5.5 furlongs, so he stretched out some here. And he proved it was no problem at all. And like you said, what I really liked, he did it so professionally. He looked like an older horse who's run 10 or 15 times. He just handled the field really easy.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how he continues developing relative to his rivals, because he does seem like this horse that has a real physical maturity edge on the other 2-year-olds at this point. And those horses, the others catch up to them at some point in the future. That's usually what happens. And we'll see if he keeps getting better with added distance. I know he's a son of hard spun, and they're very versatile in terms of stamina and speed. But on the dam side, he's out of just a pure sprinter. I believe his dam's name was Light Green. I think she was second in the Prioress number of years ago. So he is bred to sprint on the dam side, and it's going to be interesting to see if he's got the stamina to win races like the Champagne and the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, which is where I assume he's going to go from here. But as of now, he's one of the best 2-year-olds that I think we've seen, at least on the East Coast. Just to mention the horses that finished behind him, Noose ran fine, was picking up pieces at the end, ran significantly faster than his debut. He seems like an effective closing sprinter. And I just also want to give a quick mention to Tuggle, who was third. He was setting a pretty fast pace. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but I don't think you really wanted to be on the rail on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at Saratoga especially. So Tuggle might have been a little bit compromised by being down inside. And I think the top three are all nice horses.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was going to mention that as far as Tuggle. I don't think it got a bias code from us, but it sure looked like watching the races. I'm not saying the rail was terrible. It wasn't like we saw, last week, I think it was, where the rail was kind of a death sentence, but it still wasn't the place to be. And I think it certainly cost its horse a few lengths at least.
Moving on to a race from, I believe, Wednesday at Saratoga, the Evan Shipman for New York breds. Mr. Buff is a horse that we've talked about on this podcast a few times because he's earned some notable speed figures, mostly against New York bred or allowance company. But it sounds like they might be moving him up into a graded stakes pretty soon, and they certainly have a right to do so off this performance. Mr. Buff earned a 126 TimeformUS speed figure. He's always loved a mile and an eighth distance. He handles 2 turns. He actually rated this time, which is something that he hasn't always done in the past. And he just seems like John Kimmel has him in great form right now.
He does, and I was really impressed with the rating part because, like you said, that's something he struggled with. The one time he ventured out of town and tried tougher horses in the New Orleans handicap, he wasn't able to make the lead, and he pretty much spit the bit pretty early, got beat really bad. But he's rebounded from that and ran very nice races coming out. He runs big speed figures, so he's one. Why not give him a shot in graded stakes? We've seen plenty of New York breds winning graded stakes these days, and he certainly has the talent to do it.
And I believe it is the Woodward that they're going to point him to. I think they were mentioning that after the race. And why not? Because he seems to run best out of his own barn. It's a race at Saratoga, going the mile and an eighth distance, which we already know he loves. And a number like 126, it might not make him the winner of that race, but it certainly gives him a shot. I don't think we're going to see a horse like McKinsey showing up in the Woodward, so that race could be a little more wide open. And I think Mr. Buff, why not take a shot in a race like that? And he did earn a much higher speed figure than anybody else that finished behind him because the race really did sort of fall apart with the second and third place finishers coming from further back in the pack. And I think that just speaks to Mr. Buff's dominance over this group.
Yeah, he was much better. He's definitely, he destroys these New York breds pretty much all the time now. And, he's a 5-year-old gelding. He should be at his peak right now. So why not? I'm really curious to see how he'll do in the Woodward.
Now, the next horse we'll talk about, he's not a New York bred, but he's a horse that I've gotten pretty familiar with just running in allowance, optional claiming races, a couple of graded stakes, often not winning them. But Bone Raison, who won the Tail of the Cat a little bit later in the week at Saratoga, just a really cool, hard-knocking horse who shows up every time, no matter the class level, runs about the same speed figure with different kinds of setups, different distances. I think this was his 13th start of 2019, and he got a well-deserved stakes win in this race.
Yeah, really nice job by Carlos Martin keeping this horse together all year. I mean, maybe he's just a really sound horse, but, you don't see a lot of horses with this kind of ambitious schedule. And he's won some decent races, but hasn't won. He tried the Grade 2 Nehru back in July, I think it was, and he didn't get much pace to run into in a race won by Promises Fulfilled. But he came back, ran a nice race last time. I finished a good second. He hate me, and he was able to turn the tables on that one here. Maybe the track helped a little bit. He was widest and kind of closed into a pace that didn't really hold together. But I'm not saying he wasn't the best horse. He ran a very good race. He got a nice speed figure for him, a 123 TimeformUS, as did the runner-up, He Hate Me. And I think it was a fairly strong race for just a listed stakes race.
Yeah, I do think you have to talk a little bit about the track profile in relation to this race in particular, because Bone Raison really was on the best part of the track, racing on the outside all the way around the far turn and into the stretch. And his 2 main rivals were probably most compromised by the track. Pat on the Back, who got a little bit of a perplexing ride as Dylan Davis seemed intent on getting him to the lead. I don't know if that was the connections decision or what was going on, but you didn't really want to be on the lead on the rail on this racetrack. So that seemed like a pretty curious game plan with Pat on the back, who's been much more proficient coming from off the pace in the past. And I think that really cost him. He actually ran really well. And Killybeg's captain also, he was just right down on the rail for the first 4 furlongs of the race. And that's not where you wanted to be at all. And he had prior form that really suggested he was coming into this race with off some of his best efforts. So I think both of these horses would be worth another shot in the future.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And not only that, I mean, they were dueling with each other, and it wasn't a pace fast enough to get the red notation from us, but it certainly wasn't soft. It was a very solid pace.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll see races collapse like that, not only due to the pace, but also due to the way the track was playing. And I think you have to weigh both of those factors as you're doing your handicapping in the future and analyzing pace situations. Another sprint race to discuss that was a stakes, I believe, also from the Wednesday card, was the Mahoney Stakes for the 3-year-old turf sprinters. This race didn't get the highest speed figure in the world, but I do really want to talk about the winner of this race, Arkadust, because he seems like one of these up-and-coming 3-year-old turf sprinters, kind of like World of Trouble last year, who might be getting to that point where he could step up into some of the tougher races against older horses late in the year. The finishing speed that this horse displayed in this Mahoney Stakes, I think, is pretty noteworthy. I know the final time was not significantly faster than some other turf sprints that we've seen recently, but I mean, I know that the track's numbers can be a little unreliable at times, but I do trust them for the straightaway stretch runs a lot of the time. And they had this horse coming home his final quarter in 21.3 seconds. I think that's the fastest I've ever seen. And I know the turf courses have gotten very hard and fast, but this horse was just flying through the stretch.
He was, and now part of that is the pace was slow. We have it coded in blue, but, you know, and to counter that, it also probably held the figure back a little bit. You know, we talked about how a fast pace helps horses set fast times, which lead to fast figures. The opposite is true for slow paces. We don't really reward slow paces in turf sprints. So we didn't do that here, but he still ran a 112 after a 115 last time out, and then what I believe was his turf debut. And, you know, he sat off that slow pace. It's not like he was setting the slow pace. He was a few lengths off of it and just absolutely flew home. So as good as the 112 looks on paper, the visual was even better.
Yeah, and you just look at the TimeformUS pace figure line, you don't often see great variations in these shorter turf sprints, or you often see the numbers dropping off a little bit. But he improved his pace figure from a 103 to a 114 final time figure in between the last 2 calls. And that improvement of 11 points really suggests that he was just flying home at the end of this race. And the visual supports that. This seems like a really good horse. We'll see if he can go the pathway of World of Trouble and get to a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. That's still a long way off, but he's certainly a different horse since they switched to turf for Jorge Navarro, who seems to have a couple of really talented 3-year-old sprinters out there, both on turf this one and Chancelot on the dirt. Those were the stakes races from Saratoga last weekend. We'll discuss a few maiden and allowance races that I think are worth touching upon. Beginning with a couple of 2-year-old races from the Saturday card, where Steve Asmussen unveiled a couple of impressive juveniles. One of them went a little faster than the other, but I think the one that went slower, Tumbling Sky, is actually coming out of a stronger race. He won the 5th race on Saturday, making his debut against just a field that seemed loaded with horses that had stories about them. Catanzit was a highly touted Chad Brown firster. There was one in there for Todd Pletcher, who had been working very well, Irish Front. There was even a horse for Jenna Antonucci who ended up finishing 2nd, Bella Via, who had some workout stories about him. He was a son of Honor Code. And I think it's a credit to Tumbling Sky that he survived a fast pace, held off the closers, and beat that really good field.
He did. This was a just to put these in perspective, keep in mind these were run on the same day as the Saratoga Special with Green Light Go. So as impressive as these horses were, when we talk about the figures, we're going to see how good he was. The winner here, Tumbling Sky, got a 102, which is a really strong figure. We've been talking about any of the triple-digit figures for 2-year-olds. I actually had to leave a few out this week when looking at the rundown because there were just so many good 2-year-old races this week. So I'd encourage listeners that subscribe to our product that scan the charts. There were some really good races this week for maiden 2-year-olds. But Tumbling Sky it was very impressive. As you said, Bella Via looked like maybe he was going to get there, but he just dug in and was actually pulling away a little bit at the end. And this is a strong effort. The word, like you said, there was a lot of stories in this, but apparently he had the best one because he wound up going off 2-1. I think he was the favorite over the Chad Brown horse, but just a strong maiden race. Like I've said before, I'm not a big key race guy, but if there's going to be one, this is probably one of them.
Yeah, Chad Brown's horse, Catanzit, actually was. You didn't want to be right down on the rail. I think that's true. Like you were saying, it wasn't that the dead rail that we saw on Jim Dandy weekend, but it still was not the place to be. And Tumbling Sky was in about the 2-3 path for most of the race, drifted down towards the rail at the very end when Bellavia was coming after him, but I don't think it negatively affected him that much. Catanzit, that highly touted Chad Brown firster, he was really right down on the rail for most of his trip. So maybe he's one that you give another shot to. He also has a bit of turf pedigree, so maybe you look at him on the turf in the future. But he was a little disappointing. All of that said, though, this was a pretty strong race overall, and I think you're going to see some maiden breakers coming out of this race pretty soon. After Tumbling Sky won so impressively, 2 races later, Steve Asmussen had a 2-year-old firster that was reportedly working even better than Tumbling Sky, so it's no surprise that he was bet down to 3-5. That was Gozilla, and he was just a lot better than the group that he was facing. I think from just an overall top to bottom perspective, the 5th race was stronger than the 7th race, but perhaps Gozilla is the best horse that we saw in the 2 maiden races on Saturday.
Yeah, he could be. He got a slightly lower figure because of the pace. He got a 98 compared to that 102 from. He got a 102 compared to Tumbling Sky's 98. We can talk about that a little bit later on. There's another race where I want to bring that up, but both of them were really good horses. This horse won easy. I don't think he had to run as fast because he was never really pressured at any point. Visually, he looked just as good. So I'm not going to try to draw any distinctions between them with the 4-point difference. They're both very talented, and they're going to be tough wherever they show up next.
Yeah, it's really hard to make comparisons between the 2 races, as you were saying, because they were run in such different fashions. I mean, one had that red color-coded pace and the other had a blue color-coded pace. And it's really hard to compare races like that and put them on top of each other and compare the final times. Gozilla did win geared down very easily, whereas we saw Tumbling Sky get a real test and turn back a challenge. And you can decide for yourself which kind of win you prefer. The other horses out of this 7th race, I don't know if you really want them moving forward. They were all kind of with the flow of the track. Oxbridge and Sprawl, they did a little running to be 2nd and 3rd, but they were sort of out in the center of the racetrack doing that running. So I'm not sure how much credit you want to give them. But we saw some good 2-year-olds on Saturday. That was also the case on Thursday in a New York bred maiden race that I think some people were surprised at how high this figure turned out to be, where Tiz the Law beat Dream Bigger, both first-time starters. Tiz the Law going out for Barclay Tagg and Dream Bigger for Rudy Rodriguez. Dream Bigger was betting this race like one of these 2-year-olds that couldn't lose. I think he was almost down to even money at one point, and I think he ended up going off at around 6-5. But Tiz the Law just easily ran by him at the top of the stretch, and I mean, Junior Alvarado just eased him up at the end of this race. He won super impressively.
Yeah, this was one I struggled with. As you know, I kind of wrote you and asked you your opinion on it. I wound up giving him a 112. I just went with the clock. The races before and after his were very consistent. And obviously, these were all first-timers. There was really nothing to go on other than those races that bookended this one. It was a promising-looking race, and I don't want to be the guy that arbitrarily knocks down races just because it doesn't look right. And with nothing to really go on, I went with the clock and gave him that 112. And I'll be the first to admit I have a little bit of trepidation, and I'll certainly be watching as they come back. But until they do, I'm going to stick with that number. They both looked really good. They ran away from the field. I forget what the gap was back to 3rd, but it was quite substantial. So it has the looks of a very fast race despite being New York breds. It was every bit as good as some of the others we saw.
Yeah, obviously one of the checks that you do when you see a speed figure come back as high as this one is what kind of figures did the other horses in the race get? And while they're all first-time starters and you don't know what their histories will be, you do want to see these gigantic gaps between the horses that you see in this race, because the other horses, they didn't earn speed figures that are way out of line for a New York bred maiden race. I mean, the 3rd place finisher got an 86 because he lost the race by 18 lengths. The 4th place finisher lost by 26 lengths. So, I mean, there were just these gigantic chasms between the horses at the end of this race, which I think validates the fast figure that Tiz the Law got. And that 112 Timeform US speed figure, that's going to make him a graded stakes kind of horse pretty soon. I know Barclay Tagg was saying after this race that they're not sure if they're going to go to a race like the Hopeful of the Champagne, or maybe they would point to a restricted New York bred stakes race. I know they have a ton of options, and he has experience doing this with Funnyside in the past many years ago. But this horse seems like as good as any I've seen at this point.
Yeah, and I do just want to mention this was a racetrack that really changed once they moved to the turf. I think there was a lot of work done after the second race. I think the third race was on turf. And when they came back for the fourth and throughout the rest of the card, basically, the track was just totally different. It was plain as day when looking at the projections I make and the variants they entailed, that there was simply no way the first two races were run on the same track that these other races were.
Yeah, and just watching the races from the press box all day, I can say that it was one of these days where they were expecting a little bit of rain. They were sealing the track a bunch of times, and that can often change the way the track is playing and the speed of the track. So I think those are all good points. You do want to be a little skeptical of a figure like this. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but that notation is in the past performances, the F next to the race rating, indicating that this is a figure that we might not have total confidence in. But certainly just even from a visual standpoint, this is a horse that obviously ran a very fast race, no matter what the figure ultimately turns out to be. The final race we'll talk about from Saratoga last week was an allowance race on Friday, won by Spinoff. Only an allowance race, but we had two horses coming out of graded stakes in here, the 3-year-old Spinoff and the older horse Lone Sailor, who was dropping out of, I believe, the Suburban and the Stephen Foster in his prior starts. And really wasn't much of a matchup. Seemed like it would be a pretty good battle on paper, but Spinoff, the 3-year-old, just is improving at the right time and proved far superior to his older rival.
Yeah, he ran surprisingly well in the Belmont Stakes to me, where he was up close to the pace. Only wound up being beat 3 lengths that day. Then they took a shot, tried him on the turf in the Belmont Derby, where he was obviously over his head a little bit or didn't handle turf. Whatever it was, I can't blame him for that experiment, but he certainly came back and ran a very impressive race. He got a 121 Timeform US speed figure, which isn't too far behind what we've seen a lot of 3-year-old stakes being won with these days. For example, a horse like Mr. Money keeps winning all these smaller derbies and such with, 121, 122 type speed figures. So just a really good effort, and it seems like Chad Pletcher has him going in the right direction this time of year.
Yeah, seems like a horse that really is just hitting his stride right now. He actually ran deceptively well in the Belmont Stakes when he was wide the entire way against that rail bias that we saw. I think he only lost that race by about 3 lengths. So I know the field was a little bunched at the end, but he ran fine in that race. And he just took him the next step forward here. Seems like a horse that blinkers really do make a difference for him, because he had been a little goofy and unfocused in the past, and he just seemed to have his mind on running all the way through the stretch this time and was really finishing well, whereas in past races, he would sort of get a little distracted at the end of his races. And I think they mentioned the Pennsylvania Derby as the possible next target, and that makes sense. He ran a speed figure that puts him in the mix against those graded stakes horses. And as we keep saying on this podcast, we see a lot of these 3-year-olds in this class starting to run these speed figures of 120 plus. Those are the kinds of numbers that you want to see them running at this time of year. And I think it's turning out to be a decent crop of horses.
Yeah, it sure is. We kind of been harping on that all year. And, well, we don't have this spectacular horse like an American Pharaoh or a Justify, at least not yet. We've just got a whole bunch of horses that have shown they're capable of running these 120-plus Timeform US speed figures, which we haven't seen a whole lot of in recent years. So I'm pretty excited for this crop. I know we kind of keep harping on it. A lot of people are down and say the crop's not very good, but I'm just not seeing it. I think it's a strong, deep crop, and I really look forward to the rest of the year and see how they develop.
All right, let's move on to the races from Del Mar. Just a couple of stakes races there the past weekend, but some other 2-year-old races that we want to also talk about. Speaking of the 2-year-olds, one of the featured races at Del Mar was the Best Pal for the 2-year-old colts going 6 furlongs. And Collusion Illusion was a bit of a long shot in this race, got the job done. Watching this race, it wasn't the most visually impressive win. It was just sort of a battle of attrition that he won as others dropped away. I didn't feel like he was really making any decisive move at any point. He was just kind of the one that stayed on to the wire.
He was. The race definitely kind of fell apart. The top 3 were 5th, 6th, and 4th early on. We have all the fractions coded in red as being a fast piece, and we even have the track coded in light blue as not being particularly kind of speed that day. So, it was a decent effort, a 104 for the winner, all the way back to in fourth. The fourth place finisher actually got a 106 for being a part of that fast-paced speed duel early on. But, it's hard to say. I imagine we'll see some of these horses in the Del Mar Futurity. Looking at the field going into the race, I didn't get the impression we were looking at any real stars. I know 4 left had come to Belmont and won, but he didn't really beat very much that day, and I thought he was kind of silly at 4 to 5, but he actually ran okay. I really don't have any knocks on him, but this not the toughest field, I don't think, and I would expect somebody else to step up and win that Del Mar Futurity.
Yeah, just to me, looking at the horses in this race, the figure seems a little bit high, but I know that that's primarily due to the fast pace of this race, where all of the pace figures are color-coded red, and there's really no two ways about that. They were going fast up front. So the final time speed figures for a lot of these horses are significantly lower than the TimeformUS speed figures that they end up getting for the race, because we do get quite a boost for setting fast paces in this situation. And we'll see how these horses come back. I don't feel like this is the strongest group, and I know just you might look at this race and say, oh, it's only 4 points slower than the Saratoga Special, so maybe these horses are just as good as the Green Light Goes and the Nooses. And I don't know, maybe I have an East Coast bias, and that's maybe just from a visual standpoint. They didn't really impress me.
Yep, same here.
All right, we'll move on to the Rancho Bernardo, the other stakes race from Del Mar this past weekend. And Jerry Hollendorfer back to trading at Del Mar, and he got a stakes win here with Danuska's My Girl. This filly she's honest. I think this was her third graded stakes victory of 2019, mostly winning grade 2 and grade 3 events. And she's not the best filly mare sprinter out there, but I think she was best in this race. The big favorite was Anonymity, who was coming out of the Breeders' Cup. She's one of many horses that I think is getting overbet a little bit out of doing well in the Breeders' Cup filly and mare sprint from last year, which is just not turning out to be that strong of a race. And I think that these horses are being a little overrated coming out of that race, because she was way too short a price based on her prior speed figures. And Because My Girl was just a little better than her.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One note about the Breeders' Cup, as you said, I mean, it got a pretty stinky figure to be nice, if I remember right. I remember looking at the race going, wow, I can't believe this for a Breeders' Cup race, but there was no doubt about it. It just wasn't a very good race. And we've seen that, as you said, there hasn't been a lot of success coming out of that race. The one real point I wanted to make about this is Danuska's My Girl and Anonymity were coming out of the same race. And this is one of those cases where we gave Danuska's My Girl the higher figure despite finishing fourth. The Anonymity's second that day. It was 2 points higher on the day. And then in the past performances, it actually grew to 5, I think, because of some weight changes. And, it showed that there is some merit to what we do with those. We got 6 to 1 on Danuska's My Girl, over 3 to 5 on Anonymity. And all it really was she just set a more honest pace. She was even a little pressure where she was clear last time, but she just ran off a little bit, went way too fast early. And, when horses get a more friendly pace scenario, they tend to run better final times. And no matter how much we talk about pace, in the end, the best final time wins the race. So that's what you're looking for. We're trying to show you that these horses didn't run the best race tactically, but when they do, they can run faster. And that's what she did here.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make, because we're not always saying by giving horses higher speed figures that they would have won these races. Just as you move on in your handicapping and evaluating these races, when you're looking at the next time that they run, you do want to realize that they ran a lot better than their finishing position might indicate. And I think, as you were saying, Danuska's My Girl was a great example of that. Agree with everything you said about that. On Saturday, we saw the first of 2 really interesting maiden races from Del Mar this past weekend for the 2-year-olds. I think a lot of people were looking forward to the debut of Garth for Bob Baffert. He drew the rail in this 5.5 furlong race. He's well-bred by Into Mischief out of Country Star, the dam, who was a grade 1 winner, I believe, in the Alcibiades way back when. And he looked like a winner at the quarter pole, but then for some reason he just didn't go on. And Storm the Court, who was setting the pace on the inside, just came back and resurged and beat him.
He did. Storm the Court had a little bit of a breather. The figures went down noticeably between the quarter and the half mile. And he finished strong and went from a 93 down to an 84, back up to a 93. So he was finishing strong, but because of that slowish half mile, he only got a 90 TimeformUS speed figure. And to be honest, if it wasn't for Garth in here, I probably wouldn't have given this race a second look. But he had so much hype because he had been working with the other Bob Baffert, who we talked about last week, whose name I forget, that won easily and got a 110 speed figure that day. Just a really impressive performance. But, Garth just didn't run very well, to be honest, for all the hype. I'm not saying he can't improve markedly a second time out, but he really didn't have much excuse here. Yeah, he broke from the inside. He was pinned a little bit, but he had plenty of opportunity to get by if he was really that well-meant or that good, and he just didn't do it. So, I imagine he'll be just as short a price next time out as he was this time. So I don't know that I wouldn't be afraid to take him on at the window, depending on who shows up.
Yeah, I believe 8 Rings is the name of that horse that you were mentioning, the other Bob Baffert horse that debuted recently, who Garth was even more highly touted than. The one thing I will say about Garth's debut is that you don't want to have these precocious 2-year-olds that are meant to win first time out get caught in behind a slow pace. And the pace really was slowing down around the far turn, as you alluded to. And you see that in the pace figure line as they actually dip down lower for the second call. And Garth was sort of in behind horses at that point in the race and had to slow down a little bit, then make a move to get up into contention at the quarter pole. And just probably not the kind of trip that they drew up for a horse like this, where you typically want to see them just flaunting their speed for the entire 5.5 furlongs. Down the stretch, you could see why this horse had so much buzz about him. He just sort of towered over Storm the Court, the winner of this race from a physical standpoint. But he's going to have to do better than that in the afternoon to really live up to the hype, a lot better. So we'll see what's down the road for each of these colts. On Sunday, we saw the filly version of this race. A few firsters coming in with some stories about them, but the one that took the most money, Inspiressa, she did not disappoint. She cost almost $1 million out of one of the 2-year-old sales at OBS earlier in the year. I think she had worked a quarter mile in 20 and 4 or something like that. Daughter of the big beast, and she just seems like a really precocious 2-year-old.
She does. She was talked about like she couldn't lose, even more so than Garth almost, as hard as that is to believe. And she actually lived up to it. Now, we don't have the official figures for this one yet, but I did write to my assistant out in California, and he sent me this morning, this horse only going to get about a 90 for the effort, which just surprised me based on the hype. I hadn't really looked at the worksheet to see what I thought she was going to get, but the clock is the clock. They ran sprints out there, plenty of sprints out there that day, including the Rancho Bernardo, which we already talked about. And, time-wise, it just wasn't that great. I'm the first to admit the track's been pretty slow at Del Mar most of the meet, but particularly lately. I assume they're trying to keep it as safe as possible. But, you can get good speed figures on a slow track. We see it all the time. And, these horses just didn't run him. So, while they're highly touted, I just wasn't blown away by either of these maiden races.
Yeah, and a 90, it's not a terrible figure for a first-time starting 2-year-old. Just when you have stories about these horses and they're supposed to be the fastest 2-year-olds on the grounds, you're going to expect them to run much faster speed figures than that by 15 to even 20 points. And so that 90 TimeformUS speed figure, it is a little disappointing. But she did beat some horses that are supposed to be okay. Bast, who was second for Bob Baffert, also was reportedly training well. And America's Surprise, who was third, she's the half-sister to Songbird. Based on this race, she's not nearly in the same league as that half-sibling. But it's not like she was disgraced in finishing third in this race. And I thought Inspiressa did well to keep kicking on at the end after receiving multiple challenges around the turn and into the stretch. So she seems like a nice horse. Just it's going to have to run a little bit faster in the future.
Right. And we all know oftentimes horses do that second time out. I'm certainly not trying to write any of these horses off. I'm sure they're probably going to live up to at least some of the hype and be talented and do well in stakes races. I'm just saying, you got to be leery. Don't just bet these horses based on reputation. As we saw with Garth, there's really no free squares.
We'll wrap up this week's podcast by mentioning one more race from Del Mar, an allowance race that was run on Wednesday as Toinette returned and made, I believe, her first start as a 4-year-old for Neil Drysdale. She was the heavy favorite in this race, and she did not disappoint, going a mile on the turf course. This is a filly who had run well in a number of graded stake spots last year. I believe she was the horse that beat Rushing Fall in that race on Derby Day. The first time that Rushing Fall lost last season. Or really the only time that she lost last season. And Toinette made her return to the races here, and she looked good. I watched this race, and she just looked like a winner the entire way. She had her ears pricked down the stretch, just kind of won in hand. They asked her for a little bit, and just sort of wrapped up the honor at the end. I liked what I saw from her.
Yeah, she looked good. I wanted to make sure we talked about this race just because I had almost forgotten about her when she showed up in the entries on Wednesday. And I was like, oh, I got to make sure I watch this one. And they just said she didn't disappoint. She got a nice 118 TimeformUS speed figure she's now 5 for 6 on the turf in her career. Her only loss came in the Belmont Oaks when she didn't run particularly well after pressing a fast pace. She was the one that beat Rushing Fall in the Edgewood on, I think it was Derby week. It might have been Oaks Day. I don't remember which day it was. But she did get a good trip that day. Rushing Fall had things a little tougher, but she still beat her. And 5 out of 6 on the turf is nothing to sneeze at. And I'm sure we're going to see her in stakes very soon, probably next time out.
Yeah, based on a performance like this, this seems like the kind of horse that could have a big fall season, especially since we've talked about a lot of these West Coast graded stakes races on the turf throughout the year, and they keep getting pretty low, disappointing speed figures, and you're just sort of waiting for somebody to step up and win these races with faster numbers. And Toinette seems like the kind of filly that could step into that void.
Yeah, she certainly has the promise. She had a very good 3-year-old year. She ran good figures, better than this year. Even in that loss in the Belmont Oaks, she got a 118, which, for example, is a lot better than what we saw in a race like the Pucker up on Saturday in the Arlington Million. So she certainly has the potential to be a horse that runs in the 120s, which will win a whole lot of stakes races for fillies and mares.
Yeah, and based on the visual impression that she made in this race, I have no doubt that she can take that slight step forward and do that. Those are all the races we're going to talk about for this weekend. As always, at this time of the year, there's a ton of great racing coming up. I sort of can't believe that we're just a week away from the Alabama at Saratoga and less than 2 weeks away from the Travers. It seems like the summer has just flown by. And I'll be interested to talk about that Travers with you a little bit because it seems like a pretty wide open race. I hope Maximum Security runs. I know that they're still on the fence about how he's doing in training coming out of the Haskell. But a lot of these 3-year-olds are stepping up. And just before I wrap up the show, is there any horse that you're really looking forward to seeing in the Travers in 2 weeks?
Game winner. I really think he's probably a little bit better than what people really knocked this comeback race. And I actually thought it was really good. I don't think a whole lot of people would argue that he ran a lot better than his running line would indicate in the Kentucky Derby. And I think the 1.25 miles is going to be really good for him. So I guess the obvious answer would be Tacitus, but I'm going to really look forward to seeing Game Winner.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think I was just reading this morning, he had a very impressive workout at Del Mar. So it seems like he's a horse that's just coming into the race the right way. I'm very interested to see how Game Winner does in the Travers. And I'm interested to just see who runs because Code of Honor and obviously Maximum Security is on the fence, but there are other horses like Tacitus from the Jim Dandy, even some of the Curlin horses. Looking at Bikini's is one that I've been interested to bet back. I don't know if he's running in the Travers, but that's the kind of race that a horse like that could run in off the kind of trip that he had. So just a really fascinating race to dissect, and I hope all these horses stay sound over the next 11 days and we get to see them all in action. So we'll talk about that race when we get to it. We'll talk about the Alabama next weekend, and we'll recap all the races from across the country on next week's show. For now, just make sure to subscribe and listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form, and we are the TimeformUS Pacecast. So thanks for listening this week, guys. We'll be back at you with another show next week.